Hello there, it's me, Unlucky Baker here, with yet another video about FF14 lore. After covering the four lords, I was thinking of the next topic to cover, and since the trailer for Endwalker prominently features what appears to be Magi architecture, I figured that a fitting topic to cover would be the Shadows of Mag 24-man raid series. However, instead of simply going over the story as it's told throughout the questline, I wanna do this thoroughly and dive deep into the subject so that we can get a bigger picture of everything that happened. This video will most likely be split into 6 segments. In the first segment, this video, I want to go all the way back to the beginning and going through the entire story of the War of the Magi, the events leading up to it during the Fifth Astral Era, its climax that led to the Sixth Umbral Calamity, as well as its effects going into the current timeline. The second segment would be covering the actual story of the 24-man series and its conclusion, and at the end I would share some speculation that I and others have had on how this raid series might be incorporated into the game story in the future with Endwalker. And finally, the other 4 segments will be extra segments with me going more in depth with the lore of the 4 notable factions and schools of magic involved with this era, as I think they are better off being their own dedicated videos. Anyway, enough of that, let's move on to the actual topic of the video. After the fall of the Elegant Empire and the Ardent Calamity that caused it, the realm entered into this state of mass hysteria about anything related to seeking more knowledge, as it was thought that the cause of the calamity was mankind's lust for knowledge. The mindset then molded into this widespread culture of just accept things as they are and do not try to play God. Hence, people shunned anything to do with science and turned to faith instead, and the governing power of the world at the time seemed to be a church, of all things, a very strict church at that. One that kept strict tabs on how much knowledge the masses were allowed to learn. Due to this, there exists almost no records of the Fourth Astral Era, and very little is known about this period of time appropriately named the Forgotten Age. This era concluded in the Fifth Umbral Calamity, otherwise known as the Calamity of Ice, and turned the realm into an age of endless frost. The Fifth Astral Era was an age of untold wonders when the arcane arts burgeoned and the great civilizations that commanded such powers flourished. Alas, this age of enlightenment would not last. The War of the Magi brought the great floods of the Sixth Umbral Calamity, which swallowed once proud nations and left naught but a battered wasteland in its wake. The start of the Fifth Astral Era was looking very bleak, with the endless frost making life extremely difficult to bloom in any capacity. Without anything else to really turn to, people once again looked to the 12 for warmth. People would build cathedrals and fervently pray to their gods and harness those blessings in the form of magic. This was something akin to a light at the end of a tunnel. Basically, the 12 became hope that people could now cling to during this dark period, and it was a very important step in the realm's eventual revitalization. Eventually, the harsh climes subsided and civilization started to flourish once more. The universal worship of the 12 was so strong by this point that these newly formed nations would base their cultures around their patron deities of choice, a practice that can be seen in almost every nation of today in Eorzea. In fact, this whole era was basically the start of the beginning for the widespread worship of the 12. Yes, they had existed as deities prior to the Fifth Astral Era, but it was here where they really grew prominent. Cool little detail to note here, it was around this time that the first Sanctum of the 12 was erected, a magnificent cathedral on the edge of the Black Shroud. This very same structure was then unearthed and restored to its former glory after the 7th overall calamity, and this is indeed the very same place where eternal bondings take place. Around this time, the 12 were so ingrained in the culture that it even led to exactly 12 unique city-states being formed across the realm, each shaping their cultures and norms around one of the deities. This was a very volatile time though, as it was the dawn of a new age, and the city-states at the time lacked the stability of the ones seen in our current timeline. As you might expect, most of those countries wouldn't last, and eventually, over the course of a few centuries, the number of those city-states dwindled down considerably, as smaller domains would end up ravaged, divided, or integrated into larger populations. By the time a millennia had passed into the Fifth Astral Era, only 6 sovereign nations remained in the realm. But the 3 most prominent ones, and the ones important to this story, were Mak, located in the western basin of Yafam, Amdapor, situated on the plains of central Adenard, or what is now the South Shroud, and Nim, spanning the western coast of the Isle of Wellbrand. Initially, the dominant power in the realm was Amdapor, controlling a sizable portion of central Eorzea and extending its reach even slightly outside of its immediate domain through influence. But there would eventually be a contender to their power in the form of Mak, when they had discovered the ability to draw upon ambient ether to imbue one's spells with deadly power. Magic had certainly existed prior to this, in many forms even, but never was it wielded in such a manner and become so widespread, which led to the birth of modern black magic. This new and deadly school of magic was spearheaded by none other than Mak. The Magi enjoyed great benefits from this newfound power, using it to overcome obstacles that would have otherwise consumed them, as happened to many other city-states at the time. But they were not content with just black magic, as they developed another way to make their nation appear more intimidating: void magics, the summoning and manipulation of creatures known as voidsent from beyond the corporal realm. But the Mak were fully aware of the fate that befell the Elegans, and did not want to repeat the mistake of their ancestors. Thus, they came up with ways to mitigate any dangers that came from summoning ether-starved voidsent from the destroyed 13th shard into the source. One such safety measure was to develop an occult device, the Nullstone. The Nullstone was seen as a last resort of sorts. Should a voidsent break its pact and turn on its summoner, the mage could use the relic to disperse the very essence of even the most potent entity, obliterating it completely. Due to the importance of the Nullstone, a powerful mage called Call of History was entrusted to protecting it. She combined the power of an ether-infused crystal with the ritual consumption of voidsent blood to achieve a twisted form of immortality, that she might guard this artifact from those who might seek to destroy it. Amdapor's response to this shift in balance was to develop their own school of magic. The Amdapor had dabbled in golem creation prior to this, the ability to temporarily imbue stone statues with life, but their knowledge on this was primitive at the time. So they knew that they needed their own countermeasure, as otherwise the Mak could easily capitulate them. This new school of magic would be called white magic. Unlike black magic, which draws upon the invisible rivers of energy that flow all around us, white magic is engendered via a connection between the caster's internal ether and their surrounding environment. This distinction is a bit technical, and once again I will delve more on the differences in their appropriate videos, but what you need to know for the purpose of these events is that Amdapor wanted to develop their counterpart to black magic, which would be focused more on healing, warding and purifying, as opposed to the pure destructive nature of black magic. The Amdapori excelled in their usage of white magic, so much so that it became a power to be an equal to Mug. This created a state of perfect balance in the realm, as these two behemoths did not want to wage war on one another to avoid suffering heavy losses. The result of this was centuries of peace across Eorzea, but this peace would be fragile and fleeting. The peoples of Eorzea flourished in the peace brought about by the impasse between the black and white schools of sorcery. Following in the footsteps of Mug and Amdapor, other city-states began developing their own forms of spellcraft in attempts to further their societies. This approach to the achievement of prosperity was vastly different than that taken by the elegants of the Third Astral Era, eschewing technological growth for advancement of a more arcane nature. However, progress would come with a hefty price, as man would soon become drunk on the might that arcane poisons would bring him. Societies built upon foundations of magic were forced to sacrifice their natural surroundings, as vast amounts of ether were drawn from the land in order to maintain the city's magnificence, a grave mistake that the entire realm would collectively come to regret in a few centuries' time. The realm's enlightenment had become a double-edged sword of sorts. Each mage city maintained the facade of an edifying heritage while secretly honing their offensive magics. One need not to be an oracle to see that this interlude of peace would soon draw to an end. The mages of Mug silently turned their eyes to the dark, seeking to slake their expansionist ambitions by amassing an army of void-sent trolls. Amdapor kept their outward appearance as a rich bastion of arts and culture, but daunting sculptures of its guardians soon appeared in every corner of the city. While the actual catalyst for war remains lost to time, it is known that the frequency of political and military posturing between the two nations increased in dramatic fashion as the realm approached the mid-13th century, and ere long the entirety of Eorzea became entangled in an inescapable web of strife. The War of the Magi had begun. This deadly conflict raged on for about 3 centuries. At this point, you might be asking, how does the floating city of Nim fit into this picture? Well, in the grand scheme of things, they actually aren't that relevant. They were essentially just another casualty in this great war, as they met their downfall at the hands of the Mug. The War of the Magi was nearing a climax towards the end of the Fifth Astral Era, as the Void Mages of Mug pushed ever closer to Amdapor. Despite having stood for centuries, Amdapor Keep, the ancient city's first line of defense, was quick to fall to Mug's full army of otherworldly demons. With the gate to Amdapor laying open, the Void Mages heralded their arrival in the city proper with the summoning of Diabolos, a high-ranking Void Sent meant to seal Amdapor's fate. Initially, High Void Mage Kesar, the one who conducted the summoning of this powerful Void Sent, believed that merely the threat of summoning Diabolos was enough to frighten the Amdapori into submission, resolving this deadly conflict without bloodshed. However, Mug's ruling body of Magi, the Coven, did not share this view. The Coven ordered Diabolos to be sent to annihilate the ancient city. Kesar disobeyed this order, who was then imprisoned, and the Coven ended up using Diabolos as a weapon of mass destruction anyway. However, Mug sorely underestimated the defensive magics of Amdapor. To withstand Diabolos and the minions under his unholy command, the White Mages breathed life into the city's most powerful stone guardians. Gathering their collective strength, the Amdapori were able to seal away the Void Prince, forcing the Magi to withdraw. Yet while the ancient city may have triumphed that day, it was a hollow victory, for it did little to stall the sun as it set on this once great civilization. The era's darkest hour was nigh. The Magi march on Amdapor was not the sole cause of Eorzea's downfall. 3 centuries of ceaseless assault on the land had taken its toll, the drain of energies used to propagate war sending the realm's elemental balance askew. This final battle was merely the straw which saw the balance break. Only after the dust settled did the people of Eorzea begin to truly notice the damage they had wrought. The realm's most powerful seers were called to scry the realm's future, but what they foresaw was darkness. It was too late to amend their ways. A calamity was upon them, and soon the waters would rise to purge the land of those who had ravaged her so. As both scholar and seers cried, the realm's elemental imbalance culminated in a far-reaching flood that eventually swept over Eorzea. And with the Calamity of Water did the Fifth Astral Era come to a close. Coastal towns were pummeled by tidal waves while rivers overflowed their banks, swallowing settlements and leaving inarable soils in their wake. The great city of Muk was swallowed whole by a torrent the likes of which the realm had heretofore never experienced. The few who remained drowned as they cast their eyes and hopes heavensward, content in the belief that the Ark would see the glory of their people endure. Those who had the sense to retreat to a higher ground would return to Yaphaem to learn that they were the inheritors to a wasteland of salt-clogged swamps where even the hardiest of weeds refused to take root, let alone crops with which one might sustain a family. The few remaining Numian citizens who had not been touched by the Green Death evacuated north into the mountainous regions of outer La Nocia as the Royal Marines commenced their ambitious Operation Maelstrom. While the Grand Company was successful in turning back the largest of swells, the mages were unable to prevent the scores of subsequent waves from pulverizing their coastal city-state. Lands reclaimed by the sea were reduced to rocky reefs, leaving Nari and Olm to which Num's few survivors might return to. As most of their land's energies had been exhausted in their efforts to seal the Abolos, there was little remaining for Amdapor's white mages to draw upon to stay the waters which had already enveloped territories held by Nim and Muk. The alternative was a hurried exodus into the highlands of Gyr Abania before the deluge reached the ancient city. The region abandoned the elementals who had quietly borne witness to the Amdapori people's rapacious consumption of the land's ether, saw to it that the city remnants to be devoured in thick, sorcerer's brush not long after the waters receded, thereafter preventing ingress into Amdapor. Thus did the ruins remain hidden from mortal eyes until the elementals' glamours were dispelled during the 7th Umbral Calamity. It could be said that the greatest of Eorzea's magical civilizations succumbed to a chaos of their own contriving, yet it would be misguided to conclude that the entirety of mankind was beyond redemption for the sins of a few. Amidst the strife of the Calamity and the subsequent 6th Umbral Era, legends have long told of the advent of a band of saviors known as the 12 Archons, who helped to warn the people of impending doom and provide salvation to countless scores in their time of need. Without champions such as these, the path to the 6th Astral Era may have been longer and more fraught with peril than it actually was. These 12 Archons were essentially the warriors of light of that era, just under a different title. Those observant among you will have also come to notice that White Mage, or at least within its original level 50 kit, doesn't feature that many water spells. In fact, it only really has one, that being Fluid Aura. This is a cool gameplay detail and lends credence to the narrative that the usage of water-aspected ether was largely ignored during the War of the Magi. It does beg the question though, why would the Amdapori, who were known to be in cahoots with the elementals and mastered the art of white magic, an art that utilized spellcasting by using the environment, then end up with such a major blunder? Not to mention that we find out by leveling White Mage that there are a plethora of incredibly powerful water-based spells such as Thin Air, Divine Benison, Plenary Indulgence, and Temperance. The most likely explanation is that it was the doing of an Ascian. Perhaps there was an Ascian on their council pulling the strings and nudging them towards ignoring more and more water-based spells until there were hardly any, if at all, left in their repertoire of spells. Then, the Ascians would just make sure to cause an abundance of water aspected either in one of the shards, possibly flooding one with water or something similar, which made for a perfect recipe for a calamity and the loss of countless lives from both the destroyed shard and the source. Probably the most important result of the Sixth Umbral Calamity was the birth of the Grand Companies. The Calamity of Water was so devastating that fighting another nation over petty differences was simply no longer an option. In this dying world, the fight for survival and seeing another day was the only thing that people could focus on. And so, though begrudgingly at first, the city-state's leaders soon began to pool their resources, hastily creating central command centers to first and foremost address the protection of civilians from the coming deluge. These emergency forces would later become known as the Grand Companies. The Nemeans, despite still reeling from the losses incurred by the plague, ordered their dwindled military forces out into the rising seas to construct an expansive floating net of protective wards dubbed Operation Maelstrom. Amdapor mobilized what remained of its military to commence the evacuation of the realm's people north to the mountains of Abaladia's Spine, abandoning the cities so many had recently given their lives to defend. The Muck, however, had plans of their own. As the Grand Companies of Muck and Amdapor enacted their contingency plans to evacuate their citizenry to higher ground, the Maki were looking beyond the mountains, well beyond. Confident in their ability to control any and all monstrosities wrested from the void, the city-state began construction of an airship known as the Ark, designed to run on the dark energies of an entire legion of voidsent sealed within its hull. The rulers of Muck envisioned that the floating sanctuary would carry entire families and their livelihoods, livestock, seeds, supplies, into the skies where they would wait in their relative safety until the waters of the calamity had receded. Yet, even with a myriad of mindless trolls at their disposal, the Ark still required a core powerful enough to see the vessel to the heavens. Thus did the Void Mages sought the power of a voidsent the likes of which they had never before summoned. A ruler from one of the highest tiers of the Voidal hierarchy, Skahak, the Shadow Queen. Self-proclaimed Queen of the Void, there are few voidsent, including the Cloud of Darkness, that might be considered Skahak's equal in potency of magics. Only a mage of strong mind could endeavor to control so potent a prisoner without use of the Nullstone, which by this time had been lost to the rising waters. The responsibility was ultimately given to Kesar Blackwind, a high void mage of questionable repute and outspoken critic of the War of the Magi, the very same mage that had opposed using Diabolos as a weapon of mass destruction. Despite being the ones to imprison her, the Coven did have the gall to now turn to Kesar for help. Naturally, she didn't respond too kindly, voicing her vehement disapproval of the plan, claiming it reckless at best and deadly at worst. However, the rising seas that had already begun to swallow the realm left her little choice, and she reluctantly agreed to helm the plan, if only to save the lives of her people. Kesar and her cadre of 50 and 3 Void Mages boarded the Ark and successfully contained within a complex network of interconnected coffins the energies of Skahak and more than 50 score voidsent. Kesar, fearing that they would be unable to make her submit to their demands, purposefully bound the High Witch to the fragile body of a maiden, successfully, but not wholly, limiting both her size and strength. The vessel launched to the cheers of an entire nation, the hopes that their efforts would lead to the preservation of their society. The Ark and her passengers, however, were never to return. Despite the peerless talent of Kesar and her Kader, the overwhelming power of the Shadow Queen could not long be contained. The Mage's grip on Skaha slowly loosened, and the lesser creatures under the Queen's command escaped their fetters. Free to roam the ship, the Voidsent took full advantage of the tight quarters to make quick work of the Magi citizenry. Fearing that a complete loss of control was inevitable, the High Void Mage and her loyal compeers chose to sacrifice their lives in one final attempt to redouble the seal on Skaha and return her minions to their coffins. With no surviving Void Mages, the familiar Kite Shi was left alone aboard the masterless vessel as it wandered through the mists of the Sea of Clouds, where it has since been given a more ominous title, the Void Ark.